I can't do the whole attention grabbing intro anymore. This is the Quads Masterclass. If you want to learn everything there is to know about the quads and how to grow them maximally, stick around. We'll be talking about their anatomy, their functions, how to set up exercises, training philosophy, common myths, and I'll give you my favorite exercises, how to set those up and why, and overall you will learn everything you need to know to grow a massive set of quads. So if that sounds good to you, stick around. My name's Amir Barber. I'm a chemical engineer, fitness educator, personal trainer, yada, 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 and this is the Quads Masterclass. Let's get it. So let's jump straight into the anatomy because this is going to be the foundation of the rest of the conversation that we're going to have. If you want to understand how to intelligently train any muscle, understanding its anatomy is key. So the quadriceps are made up of 4 muscles. We have the vastus intermedius, the vastus lateralis, and the vastus medialis, okay? So there's 3, and this 4th one's a little bit of an oddball. This is the rectus femoris. Now, a quick side note on what muscles actually do. All muscles do fundamentally is create bone-to-bone pull. So they'll attach on one bone, attach to another bone, and they'll pull these 2 bones closer together. So in the case of the quads, the vastus muscle groups, well, they all share one insertion point. So all 4 of them insert onto the kneecap and they share the same tendon to do so. So all 4 are pulling on that same tendon or that same string to pull your tibia closer to your femur, okay? So we have that down. Now, they have slightly different origins. So all of the vastus muscle groups, so the vastus intermedius, lateralis, and medialis, they attach somewhere along your femur, along your thigh bone, which means that they only cross over or act on one joint. All they can do is knee extension, the vastus muscle groups. Now the rectus femoris, a little bit of an oddball because it originates from your pelvis, meaning that it's crossing over the hip joint and the knee joint, which means it can influence the hip joint as well. So that, adds another layer of complexity. So the vasti group of muscles, all they're responsible for is knee extension. They don't care where your hip is. But the rectus femoris, while also responsible for knee extension in some cases, can also perform hip flexion. And depending on the range of motion that your hip's going through, if your knee's moving at the same time, things get complex. We'll get to that later. But understanding that we have 3 of these heads that are monoarticular, which means they just influence the knee joint, and then this 4th head, the rectus femoris, that crosses both the hip and the knee, has big implications for later. So stick with me, I'll make sure that it's easy. So we talked about the muscles, but let's talk about the knee joint itself. Okay, so the knee joint is a hinge joint, similar to your elbow. All it moves is in 2 dimensions. It can only fold up in this direction. So my elbow can only fold up over my upper arm. Now I could rotate my shoulder and maybe go this way, but notice that it's still folding up over my upper arm. And that's the same thing with your knee joint. You can change your degree of rotation at your hip, right? Because your hip has a lot of range of motion, similar to your shoulder, right? But your knee is still acting in the same direction. And all 4 heads of the quads can only create one line of pull, which is for knee extension. It can't pull your knee out to the side, right? That's not how the knee joint works. That being said, you'd think that maybe that's how it works on this pervasive myth in the industry. If you're on a leg extension, you may have heard that if you rotate out, you can target the vastus medialis, or if you rotate in, you could target the vastus lateralis. And that is not true. It neglects the biomechanics of the knee joint, okay? So all 4 heads of the quads create one line of pull, and there's only one way that the knees can go via muscular contraction, okay? And that is straight up. So all you're doing when you're internally or externally rotating at the hip is you're creating a side load on the knee, and you're loading those ligaments, those connective tissues. So I put this myth nice and early in the video because if I save somebody's knees out there, then I'll count that as a win, okay? And because all 4 heads of the quads create the same line of pull on the knee, that also you can just throw out the whole, oh, if you keep a narrow stance, it'll target the outer sweep, and if you have a wide stance on a leg press, it'll do the inner sweep. That's all bogus, okay? The only meaningful biasing you can do of the quads is whether or not the rectus femoris is involved, and we will get there. But just know that all of the targeting of the different vasti muscles, not based in reality. So that was all mechanics and anatomy, but let's go a layer deeper into the quads and talk about their physiology. So the quads are a big muscle group, and generally speaking, the bigger a muscle group is, the harder time your brain has recruiting all of the muscle fibers. Okay, so the quads have a large voluntary activation deficit, and I'll leave that definition for a later video. All you need to know is that your brain has a hard time getting all those muscle fibers on board. So this has a couple of implications. One, stability and setup are going to be really important for being able to recruit the quads as much as possible. That's one, because more stable environments makes it easier for your brain to recruit those muscle fibers. That's one. Two is that the quads, relative to other muscles, may recover a bit faster. Now, the next bit of physiology, I'm not going down this rabbit hole, is the operating sarcomere length of the quads. So sarcomeres are the individual functional units of muscles that, when chained together, create myofibrils. When you bundle all of those together, create muscle fibers. And their length, the length at which they operate in, they experience a lot of passive tension. They are on the descending limb of the length to tension relationship. So all of this to say that the quads respond really well to being stretched and being loaded in a stretched position. And this lines up perfectly well with the outcome data that we have, as well as anecdotal evidence that we have. So check, check, check. So the last bit of physiology, I promise, okay, that is going to have a big implication on how we actually train the quads is the two joint muscle problem. So there are several muscles in the body that cross two joints. Like we talked about earlier, the rectus femoris crosses both the hip and the knee joint. It can influence both the hip and the knee. The hamstrings are another example. It crosses both the hip and the knee joint, right? So let's talk about the rectus femoris. Now, we mentioned that the rectus femoris can perform hip flexion, and it can also perform, like all the other quads, knee extension. Okay, here is where the problem exists. When we are doing compound movements in which at one of the joints, it's an antagonistic function to what the muscle wants to do, then your CNS, your central nervous system, just completely downregulates the muscle because it's not useful for the movement pattern. For example, if we are doing a squat pattern, we, on the way up, are trying to perform knee extension and hip extension. Since the rectus femoris, when contracting, wants to do hip flexion, the opposite of what we're trying to do, your brain's like, oh, no, you're no good for the job. Let's turn that down. So the implication that this has is that in any squatting, leg press, whatever type pattern, right, the rectus femoris will not experience any meaningful growth. The solution to the two joint muscle problem is to hold one joint fixed and train the other. So in the case of the quads, if we wanted to train the rectus femoris, we would keep our hip joint in the same position and then train just the knee joint. And the perfect way to do that is leg extensions. We could also talk about sissy squats, but there's a lot of reasons I wouldn't recommend sissy squats for most people. So while we're here and talking about squatting and leg pressing, I'll throw in a bonus myth. The hamstrings have the same exact problem as the rectus femoris, right? They want to do knee flexion and hip extension. But when we're coming up out of a squat or a leg press at the knee, we're trying to do extension. So because if we were to fully contract the hamstring, it would be counterproductive. Your brain's just like, So the hamstrings are not going to grow well from a squat or a leg press. So that was a lot of theory, I get it, but the nice part is when you understand the nuance to all of that theory, it actually simplifies your training pretty intensely, okay? So we're going to talk about actual in the gym application now. And for all intents and purposes, there are two movement patterns. There are leg extensions and there are compound pressing patterns, like a leg press or a squat or a hack squat, things like that. So let's talk about squats and presses. So like we talked about, we want to get to maximum degrees of knee flexion. And what that looks like in the gym is your calves actually coming into contact with your hamstrings, bending them all the way. Okay, now some people, based on their structure, based on the lengths of their femurs and their torsos, have a really hard time getting here without some assistance. So using heel elevation can help immensely, right? This will make sure that you're not running out of mobility at your ankle joint before you can get to full knee flexion. So putting some heel elevation in your squatting type movement patterns or on your machines, right, can make a huge difference. You can put 2 tiny plates under your feet, but I highly recommend using squat wedges or squat shoes, which have a heel elevated platform actually within them. So let's talk about your feet. And there's a few things to talk about here. Okay, first, where do we put them? So we'll talk about width first. How far apart do we put them? So what I'd recommend for most people, right, and this is individual specific because people have different shapes of their hips and their femurs, okay, but most people are gonna wanna take a slightly wider stance, wider than hip width apart, and then turn their toes out slightly or turn their femurs out slightly. Okay, what this is gonna do is give you more hip flexion to work with so that we can actually sink deeper and get to that full knee flexion, okay? So feet slightly wider than hip width apart, toes slightly turned out, okay? And the last thing is, how do we put them, forward and back? And this is when things start getting exercise specific. Okay, now in like a free weight squat, we don't have the freedom to move our feet forward and back, because if we do, if the bar is not in line with our midfoot, we're gonna tip over, right? It's just the physics of it, right? But if we start talking about leg presses or hack squats, right? Things where we have a platform to push off of, then we want to place our foot as low as we can, only if we can get to a full degree of knee flexion without our heels raising up. Because if you keep putting your feet lower, the only way that you're gonna be able to get there eventually is by your heels coming up, okay? So you want to shimmy them forward until you get to a point where your feet are nice, flat, and stable against that platform. And that brings us to the last thing just about the foot in general. So when you are squatting or leg pressing, you want to maintain pressure through your whole foot, right? You want to be stable. You want to be pushing through the outside of your foot, the ball of your foot, and your heel, okay? So what will get in the way of that even pressure and gripping the ground with your feet is weird gym shoes or running shoes, okay? I almost don't even want to call them gym shoes, but what most people consider gym shoes. Anything that has like a flat, or not a flat, like a rocking chair shaped sole or is really cushy and unstable, okay? May be great for walking or running, not good for having a solid connection with the ground when you are moving heavy loads. So either kick your shoes off and just do it in your socks, or get weightlifting shoes with minimal soles that are flat. And in any case, your knees should be tracking directly over your toes. So whichever way that your toes are pointing, your knees should travel forward in that same direction. So when we're approaching the bottom position of that full knee bend, there's a few things you want to keep in mind. One, on the way down, control the descent. Do not dive bomb into the bottom and slap your hamstrings along your calves and then just bounce back up. That is going to be bad for your knees, and it's not going to be good for quad growth either. So you want to control the way down, and when you're in that bottom position, you should maintain tension. You should not just be sitting passively on your calves. This is going to stress out your knee joint a good amount, okay? So when you get to that bottom, we approach there in a controlled manner and we maintain tension. So now that we understand those global training principles, let's talk about actual exercise selection and narrow things down. Like, what are we actually doing in the gym to grow our quads maximally? And the answer is relatively simple. One, we need some type of squatting or pressing pattern with deep knee flexion. And two, we need a leg extension in order to train the rectus femoris, all right? And actually train the quads in a shortened position. So the deep knee flexion stuff is going to train the vastus, 3 out of the 4 quads, okay? And then the leg extensions are going to train all 4 heads of the quads. So we need that leg extension. And also it's worth noting that the leg extension is the only movement in which we are training the quads in their fully contracted position. So that adds another layer of value. But all you need is 2 good movements and just getting strong at 2 good movements. And here are my recommendations for the squats or the pressing motions. My top compound movement that I'd recommend for growing the quads is the banded hack squat. Okay, and this is amazing for so many different reasons. Let's just talk about the hack squat for a second and put the band to the side. So why would I prefer the hack squat over something like a heel elevated barbell squat, which is still a great option, okay? The hack squat is just so much more stable. Okay, if you've ever known somebody who barbell back squats a lot of weight, usually their lower back is the weakest link in the chain of the movement. Their lower back fatigues first, or maybe they even have lower back issues that prevent them from, really taking the quads to what they're capable of doing. Meanwhile, on the hack squat machine, you have a stable pad for your hips and your spine and your shoulders to push into, which allows you and just removes the weak links from the chain of the movement, which allows you to push the quads to what they're capable of. So bracing and stability are key. Another thing with the back pad that's awesome is that you can push back into it, which creates a reactionary force at your foot. So there's more friction at the foot, which changes the line of force so that there is more torque delivered to the knee. And if there's more torque to the knee, the quads have to do more work and they grow better. So the last thing with the hack squat is that it's relatively easy to get to a high degree of knee flexion on, right? So everything I said previously could also apply to a leg press to an even greater extent. The problem with leg pressing is that often you're not able to get to that full degree of knee flexion because you run out of hip flexion. You're basically like eating your thighs at that bottom position. So now let's talk about the band. Why do we use the band? And this starts getting down a rabbit hole of resistance profiles and strength profiles and torque. And if you want to learn more about that, I'll have the videos down below in the description. Watch at your own leisure. Okay, but I'm going to give a very base level explanation. Okay, so how we're going to set up the band is it's going to be completely slack at the top position. Then as we drop into the bottom position, it's going to get tense and it's going to assist the weight up for us. So it'll make it relatively easier at the bottom and relatively harder at the top from an absolute external load standpoint. And what it does is it matches the resistance profile more closely to what we are capable of, our strength profile. Okay, so just to highlight the point, okay? If you took someone barbell back squatting, let's say they loaded up 4 plates and you just saw them standing up and doing the first 2 inches of the range of motion at the top, you'd be like, oh, that dude's he can't squat 4 plates, right? He's doing 2 inches of range of motion at the top. But if the guy next to him was still doing 2 inches of range of motion, but he was all the way down with like a parallel squat and just owning those last 2 inches of the range of motion, you'd be like, holy crap, he's strong. Because you have to generate so much more torque in that bottom position than at the top position. So when we band it, what we're doing is we're making the top relatively harder so we can actually challenge ourselves in the top position. Because let's just remove the band from the equation for a sec. Let's say if you can only handle 3 plates in that bottom position where you are weakest, okay? We throw 3 plates on, we can get to the bottom, we grind out through the bottom, then boop, we just pop up through the top because it's so much easier. Instead, what we do if we add the band is now we can load 4 plates on. So maybe it's still 3 plates in the bottom, but as we get to the top, the challenge is increasing and matching what we're capable of, so we're not under-training this top half of the range of motion. And that's where I'm gonna leave the explanation for now. So if you don't have a hack squat, here's a really good alternative. You could do a quad-biased Smith machine squat. So with this movement pattern, you're definitely gonna wanna have your heels elevated, and if the Smith machine is at an angle, the rail is at an angle, you want to face the direction shown in the video here. Now I'll briefly talk about the leg press. If you wanted to turn it into more of a quad bias, you'd put your feet relatively lower on the platform. Again, same rule applies. You wouldn't want your heels lifting up too much when you get to that bottom position, And the crux of the leg press is that it's really hard to get to that full knee flexion position. So it trains more of the mid-ish range of the quads rather than the fully lengthened position. And then the last note, actually the most elite machine, I lied to you guys, is the pendulum squat. Just nobody has a pendulum squat, so I was like, why would I mention it? Okay, but if you see this machine in a gym, 1, sign up for the gym. 2, absolutely use this. There's so many reasons this is amazing. The resistance profile is automatically adjusted. Basically, you don't need to band it. That's 1. 2, the way that your torso moves relative to the foot plate, you probably don't need heel elevation either. It's really friendly for dorsiflexion, and it has all the same benefits as a hack squat from a bracing and stability standpoint. Amazing. But again, most places don't have it, so that's why I didn't make it the top movement. So out of those movement patterns I mentioned, you're going to pick 1 of those compound movements, just 1, and focus on getting strong at it. And then we are going to pair that movement with a leg extension, okay? So we're gonna use a leg extension machine. Yes, you could talk about sissy squats. I don't think they're a good idea for most people, and a leg extension is just creme de la creme. This is where you wanna be, okay? Rules of using a leg extension machine. Okay, first and foremost, align the center of your knee joint with the pivot on the machine. So wherever you see the machine rotating about, that's where you want to align your knee joint with, not the front of your kneecaps, the center of your knee joint. Okay, and the way to influence where your knees are actually going to be is the back pad setting. Okay, so if your knees are too far back, you push the back pad setting forward, and if they're too far forward, you put the back pad setting back, okay? So that's number 1. Number 2, where do we put the ankle or shin pad? Well, you wanna put it on your shins, okay? So make sure it's above your ankle joint. That's a big mistake I see, like people let it ride the top of their feet. Put it up a little bit so it's slightly above your ankle joint, because we don't wanna load the ankle joint for no reason. It's unnecessary. Okay, so that's rule number 2. Rule number 3, yank yourself into that seat. Really pull yourself into that seat the whole time, okay? And number 4 is if your back pad is upright, you wanna be stable into that back pad, right? Like you wanna have your back in contact, or at least your hips in contact with that pad. So that being said, those are all the major rules of actually getting into the machine. Now, when you're performing it, you want to keep let's say at the bottom position, you want to keep your knees straight in front of you, all right? And as you come up, you want your kneecaps pointing towards the ceiling, right? So do not rotate your leg this way or that way, and make sure that they are nice and neutral, okay? Because like we talked about, rotating them is just gonna load the side of your knee, which is just bad for your connective tissues. Now, some leg extensions actually have this setting where you can put the pad actually further back to get more of a stretch on the quads. What I would say is that if you're getting at least like 90 degrees of knee bend, that's a really good starting position. You can go a little bit further back if the machine allows, but we really want to be training and emphasizing the shortened range and the squeeze on these, because in any squatting type motion, when you get to the top, right, where you're fully standing upright, there's almost no tension on the quads, right? So we never really train them in their fully shortened position, and that's why we want to use the leg extension. On top of that, the leg extension is what's going to grow your rectus femoris, right? Because that muscle is not going to grow from that squatting pattern that we had, or the leg pressing pattern, okay? So, I mean, TLDR, if you skip to the end of the video, all you need is a leg extension and a compound movement that prioritizes deep knee flexion. Now, the last thing, if you're doing both of these in the same workout, I would put the leg extensions first. Generally, in shortened position movements, they're less fatiguing, and you'll also warm up your knees. So putting those first makes sense, or at least before your heavy squatting type pattern. So now we are drawing to a close for the Quads Masterclass, but before you go, let me just say a couple of things, okay? If you don't have a banded hack squat or a hack squat, don't feel bad, because a heel elevated Smith machine squat or barbell back squat is still going to work very, very well. Like, we're talking about like the difference between optimizing, but the meat and potatoes is still there. okay? And that's where you're gonna get the most of your benefit from, okay? You wanna focus on loading these movements over time, prioritizing progressive overload, and don't keep swapping out which one you do. Choose whatever squatting pattern is working for you and feels best, and just get brutally strong at that, and your quads will grow, okay? So that's what I wanted to say about that. And lastly, if you want the appearance of a wide set of legs from the front and a nice set of quads, okay? Of course, growing the quads is gonna be very helpful, but what a lot of people sleep on is actually your adductors create that width to your quad. So your adductors, the machine where you're squeezing in, can also be trained through squatting type patterns. That is what's going to give the appearance of width and fullness to those quads. So don't lack on the adductors training. Throw in some squeezy ends somewhere in your workout routine and you'll be good. And lastly, all of this conversation was around maximizing muscle growth, okay? And I don't believe any of these movement patterns are inherently dangerous for the knees, okay? I think misapplication of form and load is what causes those issues. That being said, if you do have orthopedic issues in your knees, you do not need to go to full knee flexion. Go to what is comfortable and pain-free, and you can still grow your quads just fine. I think that's all the caveats I had. So if you enjoyed this, great. Go use it to grow a massive set of quads. Peace.